All right, let's start with the big story that we are tracking at this hour, where voting is underway in Russia for the presidential elections, with President Vladimir Putin all set to secure a historic fourth Kremlin term amidst the escalating tensions with Britain and its allies over a spy poisoning case. Now, the voting opened in Moscow in Russia's presidential election at around 8 a.m. local time. The President Vladimir Putin also arrived at the polling station in Moscow to cast his vote. After casting his vote, Putin said that he will be extremely happy with any result which will let him serve for another term. He has said that he had no doubts about his choice. Now, the polling stations opened in the far east of the country at about 8 a.m. on 8 p.m. GMT on Saturday and will close in Kaliningrad, Russia's enclave on the European Union's border, at about 6 p.m. GMT on Sunday. Now, Putin's aides are in fact targeting a victory of at least 70% of the vote, with a turnout of more than 70%. Now, a better result than the 4 presidential elections that have been held in the last 18 years, in which the country has been under his control. Vladimir Putin is already the country's longest-serving leader since the Soviet dictator Joseph Stalin, and a win here would mean that Putin will lead Russia until the year 2024, after which he's constitutionally obliged to step aside, unless, of course, he brings about a change in the constitution like what Xi Jinping has done in China. The President Vladimir Putin has dominated Russia's political landscape for about 18 years, and today's election is all set to give him a commanding and a predictable victory. But the majority of voters see no viable alternative to Putin. He has total dominance of the political scene, and none of the 7 candidates registered to run pose any threat to Vladimir Putin. But the first politician in years to challenge the Kremlin's grip on power, Alexei Navalny, has been barred from the race because of a corruption conviction, which Navalny claims was actually fabricated by the Kremlin. He's calling for a boycott of the election, saying that it is an undemocratic farce that's being played out, and deploying supporters to collect evidence of anyone who is found rigging the ballot to inflate the turnout and also support for Putin. Now, the debate over how to counter Putin and also the state of the Russian democracy has proven to be a fractious one in the ranks of the country's political opposition. Some opposition figures argue that persuading anti-Putin voters to boycott the election will be a boon for the Kremlin. All right, now for more on this, we are joined in by WION's correspondent, Julia Chapman, who's joining us from Moscow. Julia, this is an interesting bit of an election, although the result of it is not in doubt at all. Vladimir Putin is all likely to sweep through the polls. But the big question, of course, is, how is this likely to impact Russia? At this point of time, Russia is seen to be emerging, it's standing up to the United States, but this is also an election which will go on to cement Vladimir Putin. How much of a prestige issue is it for Vladimir Putin for him to win this election big?
Yes, well, as you say, the result is basically a foregone conclusion. And it's meant to cement Vladimir Putin's power for the next 6 years he'll have in office. And that's why all eyes here are on the turnout. That's very important to Putin and his team. They're hoping for what they're calling a 70-70 result. That's 70% turnout and 70% of that result of that turnout for Putin himself. And so far, the signs of high turnout are pretty significant. So they're saying that compared to 12 years ago, as of this hour, basically around lunchtime, there's a higher turnout compared to the election 6 years ago. So that's good for Putin's team, and they're hoping that will strengthen his legitimacy going into his next term as president, which will be his 4th. And his team is trying to do everything it can to strengthen that turnout. They're holding simultaneous referenda on other issues to try to motivate voters to the polling station. They're hoping to entice people with selfie competitions and competitions for a free car or tickets to a concert, as well as discounted groceries and that kind of thing. So yes, a high turnout is definitely important for this election and to strengthen Vladimir Putin's hand.
Right, it is interesting that those sort of inducements are being given for voters to actually go out and vote. Do we, at this point of time, have any information at all as to the percentage of the voter turnout that has taken place?
Not yet certainties, but it's looking pretty strong. And, across the country, people have started voting across the 11 time zones early this morning in the Far East, in Kamchatka region. And they're showing strong signs of a very high turnout in that part of the country. So we'll see as we go through the day across the country in all the different time zones, all the way to Kaliningrad in the far west. So turnout is looking, yes, quite high. And that will be definitely a boon for the Vladimir Putin campaign.
Right, and also considering the fact that Vladimir Putin has been in the driver's seat in Russia since 1999, why is it that there is absolutely no sort of credible opposition to Vladimir Putin in Russia at this point of time?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, there are 8 candidates running in this election. In fact, Vladimir Putin is just one of them. But most of the other candidates are not seen as credible alternatives. The others are polling much lower than Putin. So even though they are state-run polls, they are actually probably fairly accurate. And they are suggesting that a 70% turnout with 70% result for Putin is actually realistic. The closest competitor is the Communist Party's Pavel Grudinin, and he's polling some 10 times behind Putin at about 6 or 7%, and other candidates even lower. So there isn't a lot of alternative. The one alternative that does exist in Russia, of course, is Alexei Navalny, and he has been barred from taking part in this election because of charges, corruption charges that he says are fabricated, so that he cannot participate in this election. And he's calling for a boycott of this vote. He wants his supporters to avoid going to the polls, to avoid giving any further legitimacy to this election, which he calls a farce. And he has been in charge of a monitoring campaign across Russia. His campaign, unable to actually participate in the election, has turned its hand instead to monitoring, and they say that across the country there have been quite a few violations of electoral law, and they're keeping a very close eye on that, but it's unlikely that most average Russians are paying any attention.
Absolutely, and one of the things, the fact that this is such a high-profile election and people are watching this around the world, what people would be interested, of course, is what are the issues for which the Russians are in fact voting for? Is it international issues? Is it the manner in which Putin has conducted his diplomacy? Or is it his domestic issues on basis of which that he'll be tested in these polls?
It's probably a combination of those two things. I mean, most, average Russians aren't particularly interested in what's going on in the rest of the world, but they like the image that Vladimir Putin projects. And that's an image, of course, of strength, and that he doesn't cow to other countries, particularly with regards to, the annexation of Crimea, which is particularly significant today because today is, in fact, the anniversary of that annexation. Absolutely. And Putin doesn't want anybody to forget that. That's why the election's being held today of all days. And so, internationally, yes, there's definitely some emphasis on that, but it's more, I think, on domestic issues, on quality of life. Vladimir Putin did very little campaigning in this election, but in one speech that he did give on March 1st, he talked at length about domestic issues, economic issues, making lives better for everybody, making the standard of living higher, increasing GDP, lowering, debt, and increasing life expectancy, which is very low in Russia, significantly. So I think most people credit Putin as well with an improvement in their standard of living, particularly after the chaotic period of the 90s. And ever since he came into power, there's been stability. That's the word that's usually associated with Vladimir Putin's time in power.
I'd like to touch upon the point that you brought up. This is the day which marks the 4th anniversary of the annexation of Crimea by Russia in the year 2014. The date of the election, was this something that was done deliberately, or is it just mere coincidence that 18th of March, the day on which Russia is likely to re-elect Vladimir Putin, is also the 4th year anniversary of the annexation of Crimea?
Yeah, it's certainly no coincidence. The election was in fact changed to fall on this date, so it's quite significant that it's doing so. And Putin definitely wants to remind people of the annexation of Crimea. That particular situation in Russia polls very well. It's got extremely high approval ratings. Most people do consider that Crimea is part of Russia and should rightly be part of Russia. Notably, one of the opposition candidates, Ksenia Sobchak, who's only polling at about 2 or 3%, in her announcement of her participation in this election, she very pointedly said that Crimea is Ukraine and should be part of Ukraine, which is not a very popular opinion in Russia and very controversial to say so. She's also been allowed to say so on state television, which is significant, right. But in reality it has very little impact. But yes, it's very important for Putin that it's being seen to be held on this day, to remind people that, Putin was responsible for bringing Crimea back to Russia, and that's very popular with most Russians.
Absolutely, indeed. And you also brought up the candidate, Ksenia Sobchak. She's seen as the Paris Hilton of Russia. Now, what is also interesting is that she's the first woman, who's actually in the fray for the presidential election since 2004. Why is it that so few women actually take part in the elections, if I could put it that way? Because she's just one woman candidate out of 7 other men who are contesting.
Yeah, earlier in the campaign there was another female candidate, but she withdrew from the running, so leaving only Ksenia Sobchak. There are a lot of women in politics actually in Russia, but not as many of them, take to this particular stage in the process. There are very few who are willing to put their heads above the parapet, so to speak. And Ksenia Sobchak is definitely notable for doing so. But she does come from a political family. She's got the background. She kind of grew up. Her father was Anatoly Sobchak, who of course was a mentor to Vladimir Putin and helped catapult him to the position where he is now. So she's grown up with politics in her family. She's familiar with it, so it makes her a kind of natural candidate to come forward. There is some allegation that that her candidacy was approved by Putin, which she denies. She did notify him that she would be running, right. But she didn't say. She said he didn't rubber stamp or give her permission to do so. So yes, she is notable. I mean, she does receive quite a lot of abuse, quite a lot of criticism, often sexist criticism, but yes, she is one of many female politicians in Russia.
All right, and also, this is an interesting bit of a time for Vladimir Putin. He's been in power for the last 18 years, and if he were to win today, he'll of course be in power till 2024. Now, considering what has happened in China, where Xi Jinping has just, after the constitutional amendment, effectively he can rule for life, can we expect something like that to happen in the case of Vladimir Putin?
That's definitely possible. We've seen some sort of sleight of hand like that before, so this will be, if he does win today, as he's expected to do so, his 4th term as president. But of course there was that term in between the two groups of two when he stood as prime minister behind Dmitry Medvedev, who stood as president for those 6 years, and then Putin took over again after that period. So it's possible that he will do something of that sort again after the next 6 years, but he will be getting on in years. He's going to be 71 at the end of his next term, so it's possible he'll want to retire sometime soon. We're not sure what he will do. It's unlikely he will do anything quite as brazen as stay in power as president again, but you never know. And the question then arises, what happens next? Who comes after Putin? There's no natural successor, no obvious candidate to follow him. He keeps his allies very close, but they're not very high-profile ones. So there'll be a lot of jostling, a lot of positioning for who will be chosen as his successor. There's some rumor that even Ksenia Sobchak could be the one that he chooses, although many critics say that's very unlikely. But yes, it's possible that he will come in the next 6 years. We will find out more of what he has planned for his succession.
Absolutely. And also, Julia, just before I let you go, there is a fresh bit of information that is coming in that Russia's election commission has come under a sort of a cyber attack. This is something which is being reported in the local media in Russia. Do we have any more information on that?
Not exactly, but we do know that there have been a lot of monitors who have been prevented from taking part and monitoring this election, observers who have been having trouble getting access to polling stations. The OECE and the EU, for example, have been unable to do so. The government has got a number of independent in quotation marks perhaps, monitors that it has brought in internationally to places like Crimea, but others have been refusing to go to Crimea because they don't want to legitimize the vote there, as they still consider it to be part of Ukraine. So there have been, some issues with access. There have been a few sporadic instances of ballot stuffing across the country that we've seen, although they are trying to be rather transparent about the whole election. There are now video feeds of every polling station in the country that can be watched online from within Russia. So they are trying to make it to be seen that it is, a transparent, a free and fair election, but there are still question marks over how fair it actually is.
Right, Julia Chapman, thank you very much indeed for joining us. We'll have to leave it there. So it is a very interesting bit of an election that is playing out in Russia. So the fresh bit of information that, of course, has come is that there's been a sort of a cyber attack, which is, in fact, what the Russian Election Commission's website has come under. Now, there is more information that is awaited on this story. We'll be getting you the details as the story unfolds. And also, an interesting facet of this year's Russian presidential election is the participation of voters in Crimea for the first time since Russia annexed the peninsula in the year 2014. And WION's Ramesh Ramachandran delves into the recent history of Crimea to understand what it means for Russia and Putin alike.
Crimea is a peninsula on the northern coast of the Black Sea in Eastern Europe, slightly bigger than the northeast Indian state of Meghalaya. It has a population of 22 million. 4 years to the day after Russia annexed Crimea, they will vote for the first time to elect the president of Russia. In 2014, Crimea was the scene of conflicts between Russia and Ukraine. On March 11 that year, Crimea Supreme Council and the Sevastopol City Council adopted a declaration of independence. On the 16th, Crimeans voted in a referendum for reuniting with Russia. And on 18th March, Vladimir Putin signed the Treaty on Crimea's reunification with Russia, which Russia's legislature approved on the 21st. As it turns out, the Russian presidential election this year is being held on the 4th anniversary of the annexation of Crimea. A bigger turnout today than the 2014 referendum would burnish Russia's image and Putin's reputation. Putin visited the peninsula earlier this week. He addressed a crowd in the historic naval port of Sevastopol. Before arriving in Crimea, Putin visited the construction site of a bridge that would link the peninsula with Russian territories across the Kerch Strait. Ramesh Ramachandran, WION.
As Russians go to the polls, stay tuned to WION for the ground reports, the numbers and the complete analysis straight from Moscow.